So Ayon Maharaj is an assistant professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda University in Bellermut, West Bengal. And he is also a Brahmacarin, which means he's in training to be a monk of the Ramakrishna Order. Some of you may know this is the order, the monastic order that was started by Swami Vivekananda. And besides that background, he also has a background in Western philosophy. And in fact, his first book was entitled The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Revaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno. So you can ask him how Adorno fits in with Sri Ramakrishna, if you like. We had an interesting conversation about that on the way over here. His latest book, fresh off the presses from Oxford University Press, is entitled Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. So it just came out this month from Oxford University Press. So will you please join me in welcoming Professor Ayon Maharaj to Princeton.
So thank you, Andrew, for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. And thank you all for attending. So what I'll be doing today is giving a very abbreviated version of the third chapter of this 8-chapter book, which has just been published, as Andrew just pointed out. So a lot is missing, but I hope that at least it'll be enough to kind of generate questions and discussion. Contemporary philosophers and theologians have discussed a wide range of theories of religious pluralism, including John Hick's well-known quasi-Kantian theory, David Ray Griffin's Whiteheadian theory, Paul Nitter's soteriocentric theory, and Mark Heim's multiple salvations theory. Unfortunately, Sri Ramakrishna's pioneering teachings on religious pluralism have been largely ignored. The Bengali mystic Sri Ramakrishna, 1836 to 1886, taught the harmony of all religions on the basis of his own spiritual experiences and eclectic religious practices. Quote, "With sincerity and earnestness, one can realize God through all religions," end quote. However, there is a great deal of scholarly controversy regarding precisely how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the various religions. Three interpretations of his views on religious diversity are especially prevalent. Frank Morales and Stephen Prothero, among others, have claimed that Sri Ramakrishna was a, quote, radical universalist, who held that all religions are essentially the same and that their differences are negligible. That's the first approach. By contrast, this is the second approach. Numerous scholars have claimed that Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions from the standpoint of a particular philosophical or religious sect. Swami Dhideshananda, Swami Ghanananda, and Swami Ashokananda, all monks of the Ramakrishna Order, have argued that Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions on the philosophical basis of Advaita Vedanta, which accepts the ultimate reality of Nirguna Brahman, the attributeless non-dual absolute. Other scholars, like Jeffrey Kripal and Walter Neville, claim that Sri Ramakrishna's ultimate standpoint was Shakta rather than Advaitic. A third group of scholars, including Satish Chandra Chatterjee, Swami Tapasyananda, and Jeffrey D. Long, argues that Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism derives from his capacious, non-sectarian Vedantic conception of God as the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. So whereas the Advaitic interpretation says that ultimately Sri Ramakrishna believed that the ultimate reality is only nirguna, impersonal, this approach is broader, saying that Sri Ramakrishna understood God as both personal and impersonal. According to these scholars, Sri Ramakrishna maintains that the various religions are different paths to the realization of God in any of his innumerable aspects or forms. In this lecture, I will defend this third interpretive approach, which I believe is much more plausible and nuanced than the other two approaches. Sectarian interpretations of Sri Ramakrishna's views tend to be Procrustean, since they fail to account for his non-sectarian acceptance of all religious and spiritual paths. Hence, it's implausible to interpret Sri Ramakrishna's views on religious pluralism from a narrow sectarian standpoint, be it Advaitic, Shakta, or otherwise. It is equally implausible to interpret Sri Ramakrishna as a radical universalist in Morales' sense, since he taught not that all religions are the same, but that all religions are different paths to the common goal of God realization. Moreover, according to Sri Ramakrishna, every religious practitioner can realize God in the particular aspect he or she prefers. For instance, while the Advaitin aims to realize the impersonal, nirguna aspect of the infinite reality, bhaktas, devotees, or theistic practitioners, strive to realize various personal, saguna aspects and forms of the same infinite reality. This lecture has 3 parts. Part 1 reconstructs Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of religious pluralism on the basis of his recorded Bengali teachings. I argue that Sri Ramakrishna's views on the harmony of religions are based on his own mystical experience of what he called Vijnana. The Bengali is Bigyan, that comes from the Sanskrit Vijnana, the intimate knowledge of God as the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. As a Vijnani, Sri Ramakrishna champions the religious pluralist doctrine that there are infinite paths to infinite reality. Every religion is an effective means of attaining the common salvific goal of God realization, the direct spiritual experience of God in any of his or even her, God can also be and often is her in the Hindu context, her innumerable aspects or forms. As John Hick and many others have pointed out, any viable theory of religious pluralism has to confront head-on the thorny problem of conflicting religious truth claims. How are we to reconcile the apparently conflicting claims made by the world religions regarding such matters as human destiny, eschatology, and the nature of the ultimate reality? Part 2 reconstructs Sri Ramakrishna's sophisticated and multifaceted answer to this difficult question. Part 3 very briefly demonstrates the contemporary relevance of Sri Ramakrishna's views by bringing him into dialogue with John Hick. Part 1, a reconstruction of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of religious pluralism. Crucially, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions derived from his own numerous spiritual experiences and religious practices. Sri Ramakrishna practiced not only a variety of Hindu disciplines, including the theistic practices of Vaishnavism and Shaktism, so Kali worship, and the non-theistic practice of Advaita Vedanta, but also Islamic and Christian religious methods. In fact, these days, one of the major discussions in religious studies, philosophy of religion, is this idea of multiple religious belonging. I think that Sri Ramakrishna is one of the pioneers. And often it's about dual religious belonging. You can be Buddhist and Christian at the same time. He was what I would call he was a quintuple religious practitioner, basically, because you got 3 different Hindu traditions, Shaktism, Vaishnavism, and Advaita Vedanta, as well as Christianity and Islam. So it's quite unique and I think very, very important for these contemporary discussions. Through the practice of each of these spiritual paths, he claimed to have realized different forms and aspects of one and the same divine reality. Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual journey culminated in the unique experience of Vijnana, the intimate knowledge that the infinite God is at once the impersonal Nirguna Brahman and the personal Saguna Lord, who both rules and pervades the universe. Instead of remaining merged in the impersonal absolute, the Vijnani, such as Sri Ramakrishna, revels in various manifestations and aspects of God, both personal and impersonal. So he had a great metaphor where he said, if I have a flute, why should I just play one note like foo like that? He said, I should play ragas and raginis. Those are kind of melodies, Indian melodies. It's better, I prefer to play melodies on the flute, which means I prefer to enjoy God in various aspects and forms. On the basis of his experience of Vijnana, so I don't have time to kind of give you direct quotations about his descriptions of Vijnana and Jnana, but essentially he distinguishes 2 stages in spiritual experience, Jnana and Vijnana. He aligns Jnana with the goal of Advaita Vedanta, which is the spiritual realization of the non-dual absolute. And he uses the metaphor of a staircase in the roof. So he says that the Jnani is the one who leaves the steps behind one by one. He likens that to the process of neti vichara, not this, not this. Brahman is not this world, it's not my body, it's not my mind, until he reaches the roof. The roof signifies Brahma Jnana, knowledge of the non-dual Brahman. That's the goal of Advaita Vedanta. Interestingly, he says that's where the spiritual journey begins for the Vijnani. So where the Jnani actually leaves his body within 21 days, the Vijnani. And who is a Vijnani? Only avatars, incarnations of God, and people who are sort of divinely commissioned souls. They can go even further. They turn back and see that the stairs are made of the same material as the roof, the same bricks, lime dust, etc. So what that means is that, the way he puts it here, is that he says that while the Jnani sees the universe as unreal, as a framework of illusion, dhokantati in Bangla, The Vijnani sees the same universe as a real manifestation of Shakti, as a real manifestation of the personal God. And the Vijnani uniquely, instead of realizing God only as impersonal, realizes God in this more expansive sense as both impersonal and personal. Okay, so that's the key distinction that I'm drawing on. On the basis of his experience of Vijnana, Sri Ramakrishna affirmed that, quote, there is no limit to God. Bhagavana kono iti nei. So iti in Sanskrit is a kind of end quotation mark, but it also means limit or end. The infinite God is both personal and impersonal, both with and without form, both immanent in the universe and beyond it. Accordingly, he made the radical claim that the personal and impersonal aspects of the infinite reality are equally real. And this is, I think, absolutely revolutionary in theology and philosophy of religion. As he frequently remarked, quote, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, end quote. Brahma or Shakti abhed, that's the word, abheda. I translate that as inseparable, which means that the impersonal Brahman and the personal Shakti have equal ontological reality. This is almost unprecedented in the kind of Indian philosophical schools. From this expansive standpoint of Vijnana, Sri Ramakrishna taught that various theistic and non-theistic spiritual philosophies are equally effective paths to realizing God. Quote, the Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, and the Bangla word there is nirgun, is also personal, shogun, saguna. Jnana Yoga, the non-theistic path of knowledge, that's Advaita Vedanta, is true, and Bhakti Yoga, which is the theistic path of devotion, is true. God can be realized through all paths, end quote. The Vijnani, who has realized the truth of both the personal and impersonal aspects of God, affirms the equal salvific efficacy of both Bhakti Yoga and Jnana Yoga. Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. For Sri Ramakrishna, Jnana Yoga encompasses non-theistic spiritual philosophies such as Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, while Bhakti Yoga encompasses theistic religions such as Christianity, Islam, and the Brahmo Samaj, as well as theistic Hindu sects like Vaishnavism and Shaktism. Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism, then, derives directly from his Vijnana-based conception of God as the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. Since God is infinite, there must be correspondingly infinite ways of approaching and ultimately realizing God. As he succinctly puts it, quote, God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. Tini ananto, patho ananto. From Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint, God is conceived and worshipped in different ways by people of varying temperaments, preferences, and worldviews. Hence, a sincere practitioner of any religion can realize God in the particular form or aspect he or she prefers. Indeed, Sri Ramakrishna goes even further by providing a divine rationale for the differences in the various world religions. Quote, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Shaktas, Shaivas, Vaishnavas, the Brahmagyanis of the time of the Rishis, and you, the Brahmagyanis of modern times, and by the Brahmagyanis of modern times, he means the followers of the Brahma Samaj, a 19th century social reform movement, all seek the same object. A mother prepares dishes to suit the stomachs of her children. Suppose a mother has 5 children and a fish is bought for the family. She doesn't cook pilau or kalia for all of them. All have not the same power of digestion. So she prepares a simple stew for some, but she loves all her children equally. Do you know what the truth is? God has made different religions to suit different aspirants, times, and countries. All faiths are paths, but a doctrine is by no means God himself, or herself again. Indeed, one can reach God if one follows any of the paths with wholehearted devotion. End quote. Just as a mother prepares fish in different ways for her 5 children, God herself or himself, in her infinite wisdom, has made different religions to suit people of differing temperaments, cultural preferences, and spiritual capacities. Just as all 5 children eat the same fish in a variety of forms, practitioners of various religions worship one and the same God in numerous forms and call him or her by various names. Moreover, just as it would be foolish to claim that one particular fish preparation is objectively better than all the others, it is foolish to claim that one religion is objectively superior to all others. Each child's hunger is fully appeased by eating the particular fish preparation she prefers. Similarly, all religions are effective paths to the common goal of realizing God in the particular form or aspect each person prefers. Sri Ramakrishna sums up his teachings on religious pluralism in the striking statement, quote, "All doctrines are so many paths, but a doctrine is by no means God himself," end quote. He suggests here that one of the main sources of religious conflict and fanaticism is the tendency to confuse means and end. Instead of practicing a particular religion as a means to the end of spiritual fulfillment, religious dogmatists tend to absolutize religious doctrine itself, thereby losing sight of the divine reality that is the goal of all religions. From Sri Ramakrishna's mystical standpoint, since all religious doctrines are expressed in human language, they can never be fully adequate to the divine reality that lies beyond words and thought, but they can nonetheless serve as effective paths to the direct spiritual experience of the divine reality. Sri Ramakrishna would often recite his favorite parable of the chameleon in order to convey the harmony of religions from the standpoint of Vijnana. Quote, I'm giving you the whole thing because it's quite interesting and I think original. Once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, "When I went into the forest, I also saw that animal, but why do you call it red? It is green." Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, "Yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color and now it has none. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal, saguna, as well as impersonal, nirguna. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument." End quote. Like the chameleon, which appears in various colors and sometimes has no color at all, God assumes various forms for different types of spiritual aspirants. While most people make the mistake of thinking that the chameleon only has the color which they see it as having, or think of it as having, the man always sitting under the tree, this unique person, sees that the chameleon has various colors and hence that everyone is partially correct. The colorless chameleon corresponds to Nirguna, Brahman, the impersonal Brahman, while the chameleon with various colors corresponds to Saguna Shakti, the personal God. And it is clear that Sri Ramakrishna does not privilege Nirguna Brahman in any way. As we saw earlier, Sri Ramakrishna consistently maintains that the impersonal Brahman and the personal Shakti have equal ontological reality. The man sitting under the tree, that unique person, represents the Vijnani, such as Sri Ramakrishna himself, who has realized both the Saguna and Nirguna aspects of God, and hence affirms on the basis of his own spiritual experience that all religions are salvifically effective paths. Sri Ramakrishna's Chameleon Parable also helps clarify the common goal of God realization to which all spiritual paths lead. And here I think Sri Ramakrishna's views resonate to a certain extent with Mark Heim's multiple salvations theory. I'm not going into detail, but I'm just flagging that. While the Advaita Vedantan hegemonically imposes the goal of realizing the impersonal Brahman onto all the world religions, the Chameleon Parable implies a very broad and non-hegemonic soteriological outlook. People of varying temperaments can realize the infinite God in any of her innumerable forms and aspects, all of which are real. Although different people see the chameleon in different colors, they all see one and the same chameleon. So to illustrate the difference between what I would characterize as Advaitic inclusivism and Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism, I've done this diagram with great difficulty. So here it is. Okay, on the Advaitic inclusivist paradigm, Christians, through Christian spiritual practice, can genuinely realize the Christian God, Advaitans admit. Muslims can realize God as Allah. Hindus can realize God in all sorts of forms, Ramakrishna, Kali, Shiva, whatever they like. However, there's a catch. The catch is that Advaita Vedantins say that that's not salvation. Realizing their favorite God in the form of Christ or Allah or Rama is just the realization of Saguna Brahman, which is itself ultimately unreal, so that can't possibly constitute moksha or liberation from transmigratory existence. But it does help. It's a kind of preparatory practice for the purpose of purifying and concentrating the mind. Once they realize Saguna Brahman, there's a further step. the Christian needs to practice what's called Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge or discrimination, and finally realize the impersonal non-dual absolute, which is the only ultimate reality. Same goes for the Muslims, same goes for Hindus. So that's why I'm calling it inclusivism in Alan Race's sense. I'll come to that later. In contrast, we have what I think is a really robustly pluralist paradigm of Sri Ramakrishna. What he says is that Christians, through Christian practice, directly attain salvation, and salvation is the realization of God in one particular aspect. So realization of some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. Same goes for Muslims, same goes for Hindus, same goes for Advaita Vedantins. They'll realize the impersonal aspect of the same impersonal, personal, absolute, or infinite reality. Buddhists. And we can extend that ad infinitum. Sri Ramakrishna's non-hegemonic outlook, or I guess I'll go back for a bit. So, Sri Ramakrishna's non-hegemonic outlook is also captured by the well-known parable of the blind man and the elephant, which he was fond of reciting. Quote, "One can rightly speak of God only after one has seen him. He who has seen God knows really and truly that God has form and that he is formless as well. He has many other aspects that cannot be described. Once some blind men chanced to come near an elephant. A person explained to them, quote, 'Oh, this animal is an elephant.' They were asked what the elephant was like. The blind men began to feel its body. One of them said the elephant was like a pillar. He had touched only its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He had touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so, a man who has seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else." End quote. From Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, religious exclusivism and fanaticism stem from limiting God dogmatically to what one has understood or even experienced of him. Since there is no limit to God, we should never limit God to what our finite intellects can grasp of him. Moreover, just as a person with sight can see the elephant as a whole, the Vijnani, just like the man sitting under the tree in the Chameleon Parable, now it's the person who can see, the sighted person, sees that all religions are salvifically effective, since all of them, represented by the blind men, make contact with the real aspect of God, though none of them encompasses the whole of God, who is infinite and illimitable. Since both the sighted person in the elephant parable and the man living under the tree in the Chameleon Parable represent Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnani, one might be led to assume that the Vijnani realizes God in all his aspects. Maybe the Vijnani realizes the totality of God. However, Sri Ramakrishna insists that no one, not even the Vijnani, can have complete knowledge of God in his or her infinite fullness. Quote, "People often think they have understood Brahman fully. Once an ant went to a hill of sugar. One grain filled its stomach. Taking another grain in its mouth, it started homeward. On its way, it thought, 'Next time I will carry home the whole hill.' This is the way shallow minds think. They don't know that Brahman is beyond words and thought. However great a man may be, how much can he know of Brahman? Shukadeva and sages like him may have been big ants, but even they could carry at the utmost 8 or 10 grains of sugar." End quote. Sri Ramakrishna makes clear here that the difference between an ordinary soul and a Vijnani is like the difference between a small ant and a big ant. While the ordinary soul is able at best to realize God in one particular aspect, the Vijnani realizes multiple aspects of God, both impersonal and personal, and so is in a unique epistemic position to affirm the equal salvific efficacy of theistic and non-theistic religious and spiritual paths. Even a big ant, however, cannot carry the whole hill of sugar. That is, since God is infinite, even the Vijnani cannot realize the whole of God. According to Sri Ramakrishna, sincere practitioners of all religious faiths can attain the goal of God realization, even though they may end up realizing different aspects or forms of one and the same infinite reality. We can further clarify Sri Ramakrishna's views on religious diversity by relating them to the now well-known threefold typology of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, first developed by the Christian theologian Alan Race in 1983. I know there's a lot of kind of current scholarly controversy about whether these terms are adequate, whether we can come up with alternative typologies. For the purposes of this cross-cultural discussion, I think this is actually quite helpful. And I'm going to try to define them carefully in the way that I want. The term religious pluralism has been defined in different ways. For present purposes, I follow Race, Perry Schmidt-Leukel, and many others in defining religious pluralism as the view that multiple religions have equal and maximal salvific efficacy. So several scholars like Paul Griffiths and Robert McKim, they distinguish two different ways of defining religious pluralism. One is in terms of truth, and the other is in terms of salvation. So one is all religions are true, or multiple religions are true. The other is multiple religions lead equally to salvation. I'm defining them in terms of salvation, and I think there are good philosophical reasons for that, as we'll see. I've made the case here that Sri Ramakrishna is a robust religious pluralist in this sense, since he grants maximal salvific efficacy to multiple religious paths. That doesn't mean all religious paths, because that becomes relativistic, and I don't think he commits himself to the view that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are genuine religious paths, including Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Moreover, since Sri Ramakrishna nowhere suggests that Hinduism is superior in any way to non-Hindu religions, he is definitely not a religious inclusivist. Sri Ramakrishna's model of religious pluralism, I suggest, is best understood not as a Hindu model, but as a higher-order meta-theory that affirms the salvific efficacy of all first-order religions. While Sri Ramakrishna was certainly a Hindu who held many traditional Hindu beliefs, such as reincarnation, his teachings on religious pluralism are rooted not in a narrowly Hindu worldview, but in the vast experiential standpoint of Vijnana, which encompasses all the world religions without being reducible to any one of them. One of the distinguishing features of Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism is that it provides an ontological rationale for the complementarity of various religious conceptions of the divine reality. From Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint of Vijnana, each religion captures a real aspect of the infinite and illimitable God, so each religion makes a uniquely valuable contribution to our understanding of God and spiritual life. His point is not just that we should tolerate all religions and spiritual paths, because they are all effective paths to realizing God. Rather, he is making the much more radical claim that we can and should actively learn from religions and philosophical worldviews other than our own, because they can give us insights into God and spiritual life that can enrich and broaden our own religious outlook and practice. Accordingly, Sri Ramakrishna would frequently remind worshippers of the personal God that the impersonal aspect of God is also true. Conversely, he would teach Advaita Vedantins that Shakti, the personal aspect of God, is as real as the impersonal Brahman. From Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, the best way to overcome religious fanaticism and to enrich one's understanding of God is to expose oneself to religious standpoints other than one's own. Sri Ramakrishna illustrates the complementarity of different religious standpoints in his intriguing parable of the washerman. Quote, God assumes different forms and reveals himself in different ways for the sake of his devotees. A man kept a solution of dye in a tub. Many people came to him to have their clothes dyed. He would ask a customer, what color would you like to have your cloth dyed? If the customer wanted red, then the man would dip the cloth in the tub and say, here is your cloth dyed red. If another customer wanted his cloth dyed yellow, the man would dip his cloth in the same tub and say, here is your cloth dyed yellow. If a customer wanted his cloth dyed blue, the man would dip it in the same tub and say, here is your cloth dyed blue. Thus, he would dye the clothes of his customers different colors, dipping them all in the same solution. One of the customers watched all this with amazement. The man asked him, well, what color do you, the washerman, well, what color do you want for your cloth? The customer said, brother, dye my cloth the color of the dye in your tub. End quote. What is unique about the Washerman Parable is its emphasis on the value of learning from numerous religious standpoints. While most customers ask the washerman to dye their cloth in the color they prefer, one customer watches these other customers with amazement, noticing that the tub contains an apparently magical universal dye that is all colors at once. Strikingly, instead of echoing other customers and asking for his cloth to be dyed in a particular color, this unusual customer asks for his cloth to be dyed in the universal color of the tub dye itself. At one level, of course, this unusual customer represents the Vijnani who revels in numerous forms and aspects of the infinite divine reality. At another level, however, this customer represents the ideally broad-minded spiritual aspirant who deepens and enriches her own conception of God by actively learning from a variety of religious standpoints. Instead of limiting God only to one particular aspect or form, this rare spiritual aspirant thinks of God as the infinite and illimitable divine reality that has innumerable forms and aspects. In sum, Sri Ramakrishna's expansive ontology of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality provides a foundation for a maximally robust model of religious pluralism. On the basis of his own experience of Vijnana, he taught that every genuine religion And the qualifier genuine here is important. I have a whole section explaining what constitutes a genuine religion to exclude ISIS, etc. Captures some real aspect of the infinite reality and hence is an effective path to the goal of God realization. Instead of stopping there, however, Sri Ramakrishna further affirmed the harmony of all religions. Since the various religious conceptions of the ultimate reality are complementary rather than conflicting, all religious practitioners can enrich and broaden their understanding of God by learning from other religions. Part 2. Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of conflicting religious truth claims, the perennial problem for pluralists. As John Hick and others have pointed out, the greatest challenge to any theory of religious pluralism is the fact that the truth claims of different religions often conflict with one another. For instance, Christianity maintains that Christ died on the cross, while Islam denies this. Hinduism and Buddhism accept the doctrine of reincarnation, while Semitic religions, Abrahamic religions, at least in the orthodox forms, do not. Regarding such historical and metaphysical issues, some religions are surely right, while other religions are surely wrong. If Christ did in fact die on the cross, then Christianity is right on this issue, while Islam is wrong. If souls do reincarnate, then Hinduism and Buddhism are right, while Orthodox Abrahamic religions are wrong. In light of the mutual incompatibility of numerous religious truth claims, is religious pluralism even a coherent possibility? Clearly, any theory of religious pluralism that straightforwardly affirms the truth of all the historical and metaphysical doctrines of the various religions would be incoherent, since it would be committed to the contradictory assertions that Christ did and did not die on the cross, that reincarnation is and is not true, and so on. Sri Ramakrishna, I will argue, is not committed to such an incoherent position, since his model of religious pluralism affirms the salvific efficacy of all religions, without maintaining that all the doctrines of the various religions are true. That's really important. In order to reconstruct Sri Ramakrishna's nuanced response to the problem of conflicting religious truth claims, I will employ John Hick's helpful classification of 3 fundamental types of conflicting religious truth claims. This is developed as an interpretation of religion. First, there are disagreements about past historical events, quote, that are in principle accessible to human observation, end quote. Second, there are disagreements about trans-historical matters, such as reincarnation and the possibility of God incarnating as a human being, which cannot be verified by historical or other empirical evidence. Third, there are disagreements about what he calls ultimate questions, such as the nature of the ultimate reality. We can reconstruct Sri Ramakrishna's stance on these different types of conflicting truth claims by examining his relevant teachings and his responses to questions posed by visitors. A prominent example of the first type, so the conflicting historical truth claims, the first type of conflicting truth claim is the disagreement among different Hindu sects about whether the divine play, the Leela, between Krishna and the gopis, his group of female consorts headed by Radha, was an actual historical event. While the Vaishnava sect takes Krishna's Gopi Leela to be a true historical event, other Hindu sects take the Gopi Leela to be a myth rather than a historical reality. During Sri Ramakrishna's time, the Brahma Samaj, that 19th century social reform / religious movement, held that God is personal but formless, nirakara, and hence that God cannot incarnate as a human being such as Krishna. Sri Ramakrishna was well aware of the Brahma Samaj's skepticism toward Krishna and his Gopi Leela. While on a boat with followers of the Brahma Samaj, Sri Ramakrishna, with tears in his eyes, sang an ecstatic devotional song conveying Radha's love for her beloved Krishna, and then told them, quote, "Whether or not you accept the Radha-Krishna Leela, you should accept their attraction, the Bangla is tan, for each other, their attraction for each other. Try to create that same yearning in your heart for God. God can be realized when this yearning, the Bangla word is byakulata, the Sanskrit, coming from the Sanskrit vyakulata, is present, when that vyakulata is present. This remark, end quote, this remark about Krishna's Gopi Leela exemplifies Sri Ramakrishna's subtle stance on conflicting religious truth claims about historical events in general. Instead of urging the Brahma followers to accept the historical reality of Krishna's Gopi Leela, Sri Ramakrishna encourages them to try to emulate Radha's extraordinary yearning, vyakulata, for God, even if they do not take Radha or Krishna to be real historical personages. While acknowledging that Brahmas and Vaishnavas hold conflicting views on the historical reality of Krishna's Gopi Leela, Sri Ramakrishna insists that Brahmos can nonetheless learn a valuable spiritual lesson from the Vaishnava doctrine. Evidently, Sri Ramakrishna felt that belief in the historical reality of Krishna's Gopi Leela is not soteriologically vital. So here, I think his views resonate with John Hick's. Hence, even if the Gopi Leela did take place in the historical past and the followers of the Brahma Samaj would then be mistaken, Sri Ramakrishna insists that this mistake would not diminish the salvific efficacy of the path adopted by the Brahmas. Conversely, even if Vaishnavas are mistaken in taking the Gopi Lila to be an actual historical reality, the Vaishnava devotional faith and practice would not thereby be invalidated, since the Vaishnavas would still be able to realize God by trying to cultivate the yearning for God exemplified in Radha's love for Krishna. Sri Ramakrishna adopts a similar stance toward conflicting truth claims about trans-historical matters. Although he himself believes in the traditional Hindu doctrine of reincarnation, he maintains that belief in the truth of reincarnation is not soteriologically vital. The following exchange between Sri Ramakrishna and his householder disciple Mahendranath Gupta reveals his subtle stance on reincarnation. Gupta: I haven't much faith in rebirth and inherited tendencies, samskaras. Will that in any way injure my devotion to God? Sri Ramakrishna: It is enough to believe that all is possible in God's creation. Never allow the thought to cross your mind that your ideas are the only true ones and that those of others are false. Then God will explain everything. End quote. Sri Ramakrishna reassures Gupta that his skepticism about reincarnation will not injure his devotion to God, but he also warns him against becoming fanatical about his own ideas. Sri Ramakrishna's overall position seems to be that while he personally believes in reincarnation and frequently appeals to the doctrine of reincarnation in his teachings on spiritual life, he never tries to compel skeptics to accept reincarnation and even reassures them that their lack of belief in reincarnation will not hinder their spiritual progress as long as they are sincere and humble and not fanatical. We can now summarize Sri Ramakrishna's general stance on conflicting religious truth claims about both historical and transhistorical matters, the first two of Hick's categories. According to Sri Ramakrishna, religions make conflicting claims about both historical and transhistorical matters, and some religions are correct about such matters while others are mistaken. He admits that. However, he emphasizes that none of these historical and transhistorical matters are soteriologically vital, so even if some religions hold erroneous views on these matters, these errors do not handicap these religions as effective paths to God realization. Moreover, he points out that every religion has errors, so it is foolhardy to claim that one religion is superior to all the others. Quote, that restlessness, vyakulata, is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Krishna, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahmo, the vital point is restlessness, vyakulata. God is our inner guide, antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path. Only you must be restless for him. God himself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right, but as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. If a man is restless for God, he gains the company of sadhus, and as far as possible corrects his own watch with the sadhu's help. End quote. Sri Ramakrishna likens religious fanatics to people who think that their watch alone tells the correct time. According to Sri Ramakrishna, however, no watch is absolutely right. That is, all religions have errors at the level of doctrine, but these errors do not diminish the soteriological efficacy of these religions as paths to God realization. The essential attitude needed to make spiritual progress in any religion is restlessness for God, however you understand God. If a religious practitioner has this vyakulata, then even if he or she makes a mistake, God herself will put the religious practitioner on the right path. Sri Ramakrishna illustrates this rather novel idea by means of an analogy. Quote, all doctrines are only so many paths, but a path is by no means God himself. Indeed, one can reach God if one follows any of the paths with wholehearted devotion. Suppose there are errors in the religion that one has accepted. If one is sincere and earnest, then God himself will correct those errors. Suppose a man has set out with a sincere desire to visit Jagannath, one of the most famous temples in Puri in India. Jagannath at Puri, and by mistake has gone north instead of south. Then certainly someone meeting him on the way will tell him, my good fellow, don't go that way, go to the south. And the man will reach Jagannath sooner or later. If there are errors in other religions, that is none of our business. God, to whom the world belongs, takes care of that. Our duty is somehow to visit Jagannath. End quote. A man going on a pilgrimage to visit the Jagannath temple in Puri might start out in the wrong direction, but he will eventually be guided in the right direction by a more experienced traveler. Similarly, if one sincerely aspires to realize God through a particular religion, the errors in that religion will not hinder one's spiritual progress, since one will eventually recognize them to be errors and modify one's religious beliefs and practices accordingly. Sri Ramakrishna adds that we should devote our full energy to practicing our own religion sincerely and wholeheartedly, rather than wasting our time pointing out errors in other religions. In short, regarding religious disagreements about historical and transhistorical matters, the first two types, Sri Ramakrishna maintains that some religions are correct while others are incorrect, but he hastens to add that all religions have errors and that these errors do not detract from their salvific efficacy. Regarding apparently conflicting truth claims about the nature of the ultimate reality, Sri Ramakrishna's approach is somewhat different. As we saw in part one, his unique experience of Vijnana revealed to him that all religious conceptions of God are true, since they all capture real aspects of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. While different religious conceptions of the ultimate reality seem to conflict, so some theistic religions conceive God as personal, typically, Advaita Vedanta as impersonal, Buddhism in a variety of complicated ways like Shunyata and Nirvana. There's an apparent conflict. He's saying while different religious conceptions seem to conflict, they are in fact complementary. Theistic religions refer to the personal aspect of God under different names and forms, while non-theistic religions like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta refer to the impersonal aspect of God as Shunyata or Brahman. Therefore, Sri Ramakrishna maintains that all religious conceptions of the ultimate reality are true, even though none of them captures the whole of the infinite divine reality. Moreover, even if a particular religious conception of God is partial or one-sided, it can nonetheless serve as a salvifically effective path to God realization. From Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, the sheer diversity of religious truth claims about historical and transhistorical matters, as well as about the ultimate reality, far from undermining the possibility of religious pluralism, provides the basis for a robust religious pluralism. As he puts it, quote, God has made different religions to suit different aspirants, times, and countries, end quote. In other words, various religions with their differing and often conflicting truth claims appeal to people of varying temperaments and cultures, but all religions also are soteriologically effective paths to the common goal of God realization. If one finds the true claims of a particular religion especially convincing or appealing, then one can realize God by practicing that religion, but one should never assume that other religions are not salvifically effective paths because their truth claims differ from the truth claims of one's own home religion. Part 3, and this is quite short, and I'll end it on this. Sri Ramakrishna's contemporary relevance. Almost daily, we hear of atrocities committed in the name of religion in various parts of the world. In such a climate, it is more necessary than ever for us to work collectively toward developing a strong foundation for interreligious dialogue and understanding. While the recent burgeoning of interest in religious pluralism among theologians and philosophers of religion is no doubt a promising development, the vast majority of pluralist theories remain rooted in Christian theological paradigms. What is urgently needed now is a broader cross-cultural approach to religious pluralism that takes seriously the pluralist views developed in both Western and non-Western religious traditions. Sri Ramakrishna's timely and sophisticated teachings on the harmony of religions can play a crucial role in this cross-cultural endeavor. In the 4th chapter of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I initiate this cross-cultural project by bringing Sri Ramakrishna into dialogue with John Hick, one of the most important and influential religious pluralists. I thought a good way to conclude this lecture would be to summarize the main arguments of that chapter, since I assume that many of you are familiar with Hick's pluralist views. It is not widely known that between 1970 and 1974, the early Hick championed a Vedantic, explicitly Vedantic theory of religious pluralism based on Sri Aurobindo's doctrine of what Sri Aurobindo called the logic of the infinite. It's very interesting, and not many people discuss this. In The Life Divine, a book published in 1940, Sri Aurobindo argues that the limits of the finite human intellect do not reflect the limits of divine possibility. Hence, according to the supra-rational logic of the infinite divine reality is both personal and impersonal, even though we, with our finite intellects, may not be able to grasp how this is possible. Following Sri Aurobindo, the early Hick claims that each of the great world religions captures a real aspect of the infinite divine reality, which is both personal and non-personal. He says it explicitly in several quotations. This is one of them. I'm not going to read it because I don't want to take extra time. It should be obvious that Hick's early Aurobindonian model of religious pluralism comes remarkably close to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based religious pluralism. And that's not a coincidence because Sri Aurobindo himself was profoundly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna. And he read his teachings very carefully in Bengali. However, by 1976, just 2 years later, Hick abandoned this Vedantic line of thought in favor of his now well-known quasi-Kantian theory of religious pluralism, according to which the personal and non-personal ultimates of the various world religions are different phenomenal manifestations of the same noumenal and unknowable real an sich. So that's Hick's favorite term for the ultimate reality, real an sich, the real in itself, which is strictly unknowable. At an ontological level, while the early Hicks subscribed to the Vedantic view, also shared by Sri Ramakrishna, that the infinite reality is both personal and non-personal, the later Hick adopts the quasi-Kantian position that the ineffable real an sich is neither personal nor impersonal. So that's the key ontological difference. Not surprisingly, the theory of religious pluralism Hick derives from this quasi-Kantian ontology differs substantially from his earlier Aurobindonian theory, that theory that he endorsed from 1970 to 1974. And I'll end on this. According to the later Hick, the divine personae and impersonae of all the world religions are phenomenally true but noumenally false. So the religious practices based on these phenomenal conceptions of the real are all equally capable of leading to salvific transformation. By contrast, the early Hick maintains that all the world religions capture different ontologically real aspects of one and the same infinite reality. The early Hick thereby accounts for the salvific efficacy of all religions without appealing to a Kantian noumenal phenomenal ontology. Many scholars have complained that Hick's later quasi-Kantian model is insufficiently pluralistic, since it fails to take at face value many of the central truth claims of the world religions. Most of us know that. After all, most religious practitioners take their respective ultimates to be literally and not merely phenomenally true. Since Sri Ramakrishna grants robust ontological and not just phenomenal reality to the personal and non-personal ultimates of the various religions, he's in a much better position than Hick to honor the self-understanding of religious practitioners. Moreover, since Sri Ramakrishna derives his doctrine of religious pluralism from his own spiritual experience of Vijnana, his pluralist doctrine also has a significant advantage over Hick's at the level of justification. If we grant even some degree of epistemic value to mystical experience, and I argue that we should in chapter 6 of this book, then other things being equal, a theory of religious pluralism grounded in mystical experience has greater justification than one that is not so grounded. From Sri Ramakrishna's perspective, then, Hick's early Aurobindonian model of religious pluralism was actually more promising and more robustly pluralistic than Hick's later quasi-Kantian model, for which he is now famous. Perhaps the Vedantic road not taken by Hick is the road he should have taken, or at the very least more fully explored. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Professor Ayon Maharaj for that very stimulating paper. Now I'm going to ask Vineet Chander, who is the coordinator for Hindu Life here at Princeton, to give a short response. And after that, I'll open the floor up to questions. So Vineet, thank you very much for coming.
We are indeed indebted to Ayon Maharaj for his thoughtful, cogent, and insightful examination of Sri Ramakrishna's approach to religious pluralism. It is an incredibly difficult task to craft a presentation that is at once substantively deep and faithful to the source material on the one hand, and yet engaging and understandable to even the non-specialists among us on the other. Maharaj takes up the challenge and strikes his balance in a beautiful way, I think. By way of a formal response, I'd like to offer 3 observations or appreciations, along with a few questions that the paper raises for me, and which may form the basis for further exploration. First, let me say that I am struck by and incredibly grateful for the way in which Ayon Maharaj turns to Sri Ramakrishna's own words in order to push back against the tendency to essentialize or pigeonhole the 19th century mystic. Far too much ink has been spilt, and perhaps teeth gnashed, over the attempt to definitively slot Ramakrishna into one of several rigid boxes. Advaita Vedantin, Shakta, Tantrika, Vaishnava, Universalist, Syncretist. Often these attempts have resulted in broad-stroke generalizations and force fits, necessarily causing vital aspects of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching or his life example to be shaved off in the process. More often, in fact, the attempts themselves have proven frustrating enough that they have led some to conclude that Ramakrishna was simply too inconsistent a figure. or that even if he had internal consistency, his teachings were fundamentally at odds with the direction later taken by his well-known followers and the institutions that now have his name. Maharaj's paper offers a gracious and eloquent response to this narrative. He suggests that a more nuanced read of Ramakrishna reveals a position that both is consistent and offers a context within which Ramakrishna's religious eclecticism complements his Vedantic conceptions. I am, however, curious about how Sri Ramakrishna, who, as Maharaj demonstrates time and again in his paper, articulated a view that upholds both the personal and impersonal conception, comes to be known to us primarily or even ultimately as an Advaitin, albeit a colorful and eclectic one. Certainly, there are many factors at play here, including our own collective biases that cause us to read Advaita wherever any Vedanta is presented. But I am curious about the thesis that seems to persist that traces back the so-called Advaitaization of the mystic to his equally famous disciple, Swami Vivekananda. Jeffrey Kripal and others have written extensively in this vein. Maharaj touches on this at the beginning of his paper, and since he disagrees with Kripal's location of Ramakrishna in Shaktism, I would imagine that he also disagrees with much of what Kripal presents as a fundamental theological tension between student Vivekananda and master Sri Ramakrishna. Still, what do we make of the apparent shift from Ramakrishna's brand of Vijnana Vedanta to the more starkly Advaita position of Vivekananda and of the Ramakrishna mission? Or are we making too much of this shift? Or has there been a shift at all? A second appreciation. By utilizing Sri Ramakrishna's own voice, idioms, and parables, the paper offers us a very human, a very readable, and a dynamic glimpse into Ramakrishna's wisdom. It is hardly surprising that Ramakrishna endures as such an endearing figure within contemporary Hinduism, even for those outside of his lineage or institution. Indeed, I found myself, someone who's not part of that tradition, viscerally attracted to Sri Ramakrishna's wisdom as the paper presents it. There's something about that combination of logical insight and warm practical teaching, some might call it granny wisdom, that makes it especially compelling, I think. As a chaplain and a student of pastoral theology, I cannot help but see this pastoral dimension of Ramakrishna's religious leadership. This comes through quite movingly, I think, for instance, in the episode that Ayon Maharaj excerpts in which the saint reassures his disciple Gupta that the disciple's skepticism around reincarnation need not obstruct his devotion to God or his spiritual progress, right? I think there's something really beautiful and pastoral about that whole exchange. At the same time, I must admit that I remain troubled by a lingering fear that Ramakrishna's religious pluralism sets up a hierarchy in which the Vijnani, who sees God as being simultaneously with and without form, is presented as the final and ultimate seer of truth. And the monists on the one hand, or the devotees of a personal God on the other, are conceived of a bit like well-intentioned but ultimately obtuse children who can't seem to see past their own attachments or inclinations at times. To an extent, perhaps, Ramakrishna anticipated this critique and thus emphasized that the Vijnani too has only a limited viewpoint, and we heard about this, that he or she is simply a big ant. But I must admit, I don't find this entirely convincing. Moreover, Ramakrishna's attempts to reconcile difference seem to inherently impact the bhakta more negatively than the impersonalist. Let us look again at the example Maharaj cites in the paper of Ramakrishna's response to the disagreement between the Brahmos and the Vaishnavas about the historical reality of Radha Krishna. Applying Ramakrishna's advice to them, both the Brahmos and the Vaishnavas might agree that the Radha Krishna Leela has metaphorical and aspirational value. If it turns out that Radha and Krishna are historical persons, the Brahmos no doubt will be surprised, perhaps even a bit jarred, but relatively undisturbed. On the other hand, however, what if Radha and Krishna are in fact fictitious or merely symbolic? How are Vaishnavas, particularly those like the followers of Chaitanya, Nimbarka, or Vallabha, for whom Krishna and the gopis together are the fullest conception of the Godhead, how will such Vaishnavas take this? Wouldn't the mere idea that Radha and Krishna, who are more real to these Vaishnavas than the world that they see or the air that they breathe, wouldn't the mere idea that Radha and Krishna are false prove to be a source of great pain and offense to these bhaktas? Or, revisiting another example the paper offers, the person who insists that the chameleon is essentially colorless may find it slightly irritating, but ultimately inconsequential, that the chameleon turns red sometimes. But for the person who sees and loves the chameleon as a red creature, perhaps who even loves the redness of the chameleon itself, the idea that this redness is merely a temporary and perhaps even unimportant state might be a truly harmful or offensive one. My final observation zooms us back out to the bigger picture, as it were. By locating Ramakrishna's theory of religious pluralism in its own context, by articulating it in its own voice, and by presenting it as a coherent system of thought in its own right, I think Maharaj suggests something about Indian thought and thinkers more generally that is quite powerful. This afternoon's paper signals to me a shift away from the tendency to see Indian thinkers only through the lens of Western categories of philosophy and theology. Instead, as Ayon Maharaj does here so well, we may allow these thinkers to speak for themselves and then engage their voices in dialogue with Western interlocutors like John Hick on a more level playing field. This has implications, I believe, that reach far beyond Sri Ramakrishna and his doctrine. I applaud Maharaj for taking this approach and hope that it is indeed a sign of things to come. Situating Ayon Maharaj's project in this context of the bigger picture raises, for me, a final question that we may wish to explore. I am struck by how much more Maharaj's description of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine reminds me of the Achintya Bheda approach to Vedanta, championed by Sri Krishna Chaitanya, and especially systematized by later Gaudiya Vaishnava thinkers and theologians like Jiva Goswami and Vishwanath Chakravartin, than it does of Advaita Vedanta. Is this coincidence, or is there more to it than that? There is, I believe, some scholarship suggesting that Sri Ramakrishna's emotional persona as an ecstatic is evocative of, and perhaps even patterned on, his Bengali mystic predecessor, Chaitanya. As a Vaishnava in Bengal, Ramakrishna would have certainly been influenced by Gaudiya culture and practice. Might this influence have extended to his reconciliation of the personal and impersonal facets of a single divinity? It might be difficult to trace such influence back, but it certainly offers a robust challenge to the conventional view of Ramakrishna as a one-dimensional Advaitin, perpetually at theological odds with other traditions like the Gaudiya Vaishnavas. With a paper as rich as Ayon Maharaj's, it is tempting to mine further and raise more topics to examine in depth, but I will let it rest here. At any rate, I am again struck by what a lucid and powerful paper he has presented to us today, and I am so very grateful to him for being so generous with his time and wisdom.
Would you like to briefly respond to Vineet's points? Yes, just quickly, and then we'll open things up.
Okay. I'd like to hear from everyone.
Patience for give him a couple of minutes to respond to Vineet.
Which water is mine? Is that, does it matter?
I have now become confused by
They have equal status.
Yeah. They're salvifically equally.
And I'm able to drink in the Indian way without touching it.
You check the videotape.
Okay, so thank you so much for Vineet Chandra for a really brilliant and thoughtful and generous response to my paper. And you raise some difficult and important questions, so I'll just very briefly address them, and then I'd like to hear from everyone else. So the first question is about Vivekananda and where he stands in relation to Sri Ramakrishna, which is one of those million-dollar questions in scholarship on this tradition. And there are different views. I'm Thank you, because I can plug the book I'm working on now, which is called Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. And the first chapter, which I just finished writing, it's a 24,000-word monstrosity, which is called The Deification of the World. That's a phrase he used, Vivekananda used. Swami Vivekananda's non-sectarian reconceptualization of Advaita Vedanta in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. And this is going against the mainstream view, because most people interpret, as you pointed out, Vivekananda as more or less a straightforward Shankara Advaita Vedantin. I'm actually pushing against that and emphasizing actually that he's, in different words, actually developing a Vijnana kind of philosophy. So that in brief, but I actually developed that in a chapter. But thanks very much for pointing that out. So I argue for a continuity philosophically between Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. The second really good question is that you worry that in spite of Sri Ramakrishna's efforts to be non-hierarchical, that he nonetheless lapses into a kind of inclusivism or a hierarchy because he seems to elevate Vijnana above other religious positions. This is exactly the view. This is a very important point. It's one made by R.W. Neufeld in an article that he wrote on the Ramakrishna Mission. And I do engage that critically in Chapter 3. I have a last section on addressing objections, and that's one of them. And the way that I defend Sri Ramakrishna against that view is to say that we need to distinguish between Vijnana so it's a spiritual experience on the basis of which he realizes that all the different paths are true. So it's a kind of second-order claim he's making about all the first-order religions. So it's not, Vijnana, I don't think it's right to think about it as a doctrine among other doctrines. It's more like, if we think about the blind man and the elephant, why is it, it's not inclusivist in the salvific. So remember that I pointed out a lot earlier in my presentation that there's a reason why I'm defining pluralism in terms of salvation rather than doctrine. So, because if you define it in terms of doctrine, you end up with these performative contradictions. Sri Ramakrishna himself is an inclusivist because in the very act of claiming the truth of Vijnana, he's denying the truth of things that conflict with Vijnana. But I'm just conceding that because to be coherent, you have to stake out a position. I'm just conceding that. And so, but he stakes out a position that is robustly pluralistic in the salvific sense. So that's the strategy I adopt. And your point about the Gopi Lila and about the chameleon, okay, so the person who's deeply, like Vaishnavas who are deeply committed to the historical reality of the Lila between Krishna and Radha, would be, I want some clarification on this before I actually address it, because I'm not entirely sure what the point is, but, so you seem to be saying that people whose faith is, essentially grounded in the genuine historical reality of Krishna and Radha, would be offended by other people who don't have that faith, or what exactly?
I think what comes up for me is there is maybe a possibility of there's something that has maybe echoes of being dismissive about it, like, oh, it really doesn't matter all that much, right?
He's telling the
redness
Brahma,
of the chameleon really doesn't matter all that much.
I think you're overreading. That's my own opinion. I think that Sri Ramakrishna doesn't mean that, because he's speaking to the Brahma Samaj people. He's not telling the Vaishnavas that. When he's with the
when he's with the Vaishnavas, he has a different tone.
Oh, it's the opposite tone. Right. It's all about how, they're more real than physically real. So it's all about, again, as you talked about, the pastoral side of Ramakrishna is that he was such a brilliant teacher because he would become a bhakta among bhaktas and an Advaitin among Advaitins, a Brahma Samaji among the Brahma Samaj followers. That would be the response, I think. And the same thing goes with the people who are very deeply committed to the redness of the chameleon. He's for the person who sees the chameleon as red, he's going to say, right on, the chameleon is red. But just don't think that God can only be red. That's the only caveat he adds. Mm-hmm. I don't think that really is dismissive. I think that they're just cautioning them against fanaticism. That's the way I take it. And then the last question, another very good question about possible parallels and possible divergences between Achintya Bheda Veda, which is in the tradition that you belong to, and Sri Ramakrishna. I think that's an excellent question, and it's one that I actually address in chapter 2 of the book. I have a section on this where I think you're right, that actually the resonances between Sri Ramakrishna and Achintya Bheda are deeper and stronger in some ways, than with Shankara or even with Ramanuja, and I make that case in the first section of chapter 2. I do think that there are differences, though, and the difference I see, which I mentioned earlier, is that according to Achintya Bheda Veda, as far as I understand it, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, the ultimate reality is Krishna, who is personal, but that Krishna's tanubha, peripheral brilliance, is the Nirguna Brahman. So it does accommodate Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal absolute, but it still subordinates it. It still hierarchizes it in a way that I don't think Sri Ramakrishna does. So the difference, I think, is that Sri Ramakrishna is granting equal status to both the impersonal and personal aspects of the infinite reality. Yeah, but thanks so much for the questions, and I hope to continue the discussion. So I'd love to hear from the rest of you.
Jonathan, please.
Thank you for this. It's a really exciting paper and a very enjoyable presentation for both of you, actually. Thank you. Could you say more about what is meant by the realization of God? Because that isn't a phrase that you necessarily would hear a Christian say about the salvific goal. Certainly not a Buddhist. So the question then is, when you say it's the same salvific result, there is a sense that we could read that as saying, okay, there's a bait and switch here. Your path works, and what you end up with is the same thing as everybody else. And when you get there, if you realize God, what you come up with is a result that's different from what you think. Is that the view?
No, but I really like your question because I think it's easy to interpret the view that way. So this is basically what it's a kind of parallel of Mark Heim's critique of Hick. Right. So Hick is kind of dooming every religious practitioner to knowing some manifestation of the same real an sich, and nobody really cares about this colorless, boring real an sich. And in the same way, you're saying, well, isn't Sri Ramakrishna's God realization a kind of real an sich or something, which the Christians don't really want, or which Muslims don't really want? I think that the mistake is to understand God realization in a very narrow way. I think he actually understands God realization in a maximally capacious way. And that's why I said at one point in my paper that there are resonances with Mark Heim on this regard. It's not that different people... Okay, let me put it this way. So God realization... So first of all, God realization is not Bengali, that's English. So it's a kind of poor translation of a number of different terms that Sri Ramakrishna uses in Bengali, which are ultimately Sanskritic. So terms like jnana darshan, which means vision. I mean, these come a little closer to like Christian kind of concept. I mean, what would be the Christian goal? For instance, I mean, that might help me to kind of answer your question. Like, what would the Christian want?
I wouldn't. I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I'd be more
Can anyone
like,
help? Yeah, okay.
I'd be, what's that?
Atonement, salvation, I thought is
Salvation.
Is pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, but then, okay, so he goes for salvation. That's just moksha in the Hindu context.
Right.
But you're going to say, well, but so moksha in the Hindu context is about liberation from transmigratory existence.
Right.
What if Christians don't believe in transmigration? But but you can also define moksha negatively as kind of just salvation from worldly suffering or kind of death. And there, I think you can find resonance. But the point I want to emphasize is that for Sri Ramakrishna, the Advaitin and the Christian and the Muslim, they all attain God realization in the end. But that God realization itself takes different forms depending on what their background is, basically. So that for the Christian, God realization consists in loving communion with Christ. Or, I mean, I invite Christian theologians here to tell me, like, what the... I don't think Sri Ramakrishna would... I don't think that would be incompatible. No, I don't think so. He would just say that Christ form or that kind of... Yeah, please, anyone.
Well, I was just going to say then, what's the unifying... Well, not unifying, but then what's the experience? Like
God, the infinite God who assumes different forms and aspects.
What is felt then for the Christian, the Buddhist, the Muslim?
So yeah.
Pattern. I mean.
Yeah. So I mean, so those are all theistic, right? So the theistic model, I think, in general, across traditions, is something like loving communion with the personal God, eternal communion with the loving personal God. Am I wrong? Or I mean, something along those lines. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I'm not sure how to...
Keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
I was just going to continue that, actually. Like, as I had that same question, actually, and for me, the dissonance was more within, like, competing teleologies. So, I mean, I'm not a Christian, I don't know Christianity as well, but as I understand it, it's a more, like, linear teleology, you know, leading up to a judgment day, and this goal to, you know, accumulate, not accumulate merit, but do enough things to counterbalance the inherent sin such that you secure a place in heaven. And that to me seems very separate from and almost irreconcilable with the things that you see with the reincarnation and the goal of liberation from that.
Yeah, so yeah, that's right. But I do discuss, so the reincarnation issue is that second type of historical truth claim. And I say basically that Sri Ramakrishna would simply admit that there are incompatibilities at that level, but that they don't matter for salvation. So do you still see that as a problem? Or
Yeah. How does he? Is he trying to define salvation very clearly, or is it?
No, I mean I think he's trying to define it unclearly, and that's the way he secures a kind of Heimean, expansive conception of salvation that can accommodate different religious and spiritual paths. I think the more narrowly you define salvation, the more you get in the problem that Jonathan is pointing out. So, like, I think there's a deliberate vagueness there, but I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I see that as a virtue in a way. And I think that, I mean, we have to do point-by-point kind of analyses about the different traditions and ask. I mean, there's heaven in both Islam and Christianity, right? And Sri Ramakrishna will say, great, there's an eternal heaven. The goal is that the Christian soul will be in heaven in eternal communion with his God. Perfect. I don't see any incompatibility with Sri Ramakrishna's view on that point.
Yes, please.
Quick question. You mentioned that he said something like a practitioner can realize errors of his religion and correct it.
Mm-hmm.
Did he take that ever to a logical conclusion that the practitioner can realize that all religions are false, and there is no God? Or was that not his thinking at all?
Well, it's not his thinking at all. It's an interesting question. But it was not his thinking at all because he realized God in the way that, he knew God in the way that I know that there's a lectern in front of me because he's experienced it. And so that was atheism. Actually, what's interesting in his biography is that during the period of his spiritual practice, he had this intense longing to realize God, but he hadn't yet realized her because he was worshiping Kali, the Divine Mother. And at one point, as he was sitting in front of the murti, the image, the form of Kali, he asked in utter despair, he said, are you just a plaster image, a clay image, or are you a living reality? So there was this profound moment of skepticism there where he wasn't just like a kind of like born into religion kind of, he wasn't that type. He needed to realize God, or whatever we want to use, experience God before he could actually believe that God existed. And so, but he actually did have the experience of God after that, and then that convinced him that it was real. But he perfectly accepts that people can be atheist. And, he'd say, keep going on your path. And eventually, and you know what he told, in one place in the gospel, in his teachings, somebody asked him a question, well, what about the atheist? What should he do or she do? And he said, he recommended that the atheist pray to God to reveal his existence to it, which is actually, I think there are studies done now about like these kinds of things happening. Anyway, because Sri Ramakrishna just, it's like somebody who says, I don't believe Russia exists, and then somebody has actually visited Russia. So he's like, try to work up the money to go to Russia, and then so that's the standpoint he's from, because God is more living to him than the people here. That's.
If I may jump in, so there's one point you made very briefly that I'd like you to expand upon, which is your title of your talk is Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, but this is not the type of universalism that implies all religions are salvific. Right? He does not accept that. So things like, if you think your religious job is to murder infidels or to kill people who eat beef or something like that, that is presumably, according to his view, not an example of a salvific religion. So although there are infinite paths, it's not right to say all paths are salvific. So I was wondering then if you could provide us with some guidelines for what are the criteria that makes a religious path salvific or non-salvific. Yeah. We're presented with new religious paths all the time, Scientology, Pastafarianism. Which one of these is a true religious path, and how can we tell? Yeah,
that's a great question, and I addressed that in the chapter itself. And the way I put it actually is that it's not quite the way you formulate it, but that, okay, so again, there's a terminological issue. The Bengali word he used for religion generally is dharma in Bangla, which is dharma, which everyone should know. And the way I understand Sri Ramakrishna's views is that he provides these criteria. What counts as dharma? And he says there are two main criteria. The first is that it has to center on the divine reality in some way, however defined, which excludes secular Marxism, for instance. It excludes atheism as a religion. The second criterion is that it has to that a genuine religion has to inculcate ethical and spiritual practices that lead to the realization or experience of that divine reality, excluding ISIS, Al-Qaeda. So that actually, I think Sri Ramakrishna's view is that he wouldn't count ISIS as a religion. I mean, he actually has like a stringent criteria, these two stringent criteria for counting as a religion in the first place. If it meets those criteria, it's salvific. Then there's an added layer. Are all religions, do they all have maximal salvific efficacy? No, is the answer that I gave in a longer chapter, which I don't discuss here because of time. Because in several places, he actually denigrates certain religious paths. What are they? Well, two of them that often bear the brunt of his criticism are left-handed tantra. It's called vamachara, sort of realizing God through sexual practices, which he said that too is a path, but it's like entering the house through the scavenger's entrance. So he says it is a path, but it's not maximally salvifically effective. Why? Because it's very, very easy to slip. Because it's very easy for lust to slip in. Number two, hatha yoga is another religious practice or spiritual practice that comes in for his criticism. It's basically a lot of physical practices, yogic asanas and kind of niti and dhoti and stuff like that. And he practiced that himself. And what he said is that's also a path. But again, the reason why it's less salvifically effective than Christianity, Islam, and these other paths is that it can very easily promote body consciousness. It can strengthen our identification with the body, which then works at cross purposes with trying to break our identification with the body and realizing our identity as a soul. So again, if we go back to my definition of pluralism, the definition of pluralism is not all religions have equal and maximal salvific efficacy. I don't think that's a very plausible view of religious pluralism. So I don't actually think that's a problem with with Sri Ramakrishna's view. He's saying multiple religions have equal and maximal salvific efficacy. That's enough to secure religious pluralism. And yeah, I don't see it as a problem that all religions have equal status.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, just in response to the first gentleman's question, if I understood you, the concern being that if all religions have, if the claim is that all religions have salvific efficacy, would that not necessarily fit all articulations of what salvation means? And so just for example, the teaching of some religions of like the resurrection of the body, would the claim be that kind of salvation is realized, or that isn't actually what salvation is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, if you
that being the fundamental Christian teaching on salvation.
Yeah.
Would it be that some people are resurrected in the body, those who believe in that, and then others aren't?
I think that we'd have to resort to something like a kind of, the Christian will actually have an experience of being resurrected from the dead. But then ultimately he'll go to heaven and then, he'll just say that, why not? I mean, like each soul will have, the Hindu worldview is loka-based, so it's kind of like we have different lokas, and each jiva, each soul, kind of at different levels of consciousness can experience different things. And so I'm not necessarily sure. I mean, these are really interesting, good questions. Working out the details is complicated, but I don't necessarily think that he would have a problem with that. He would just say that, yeah, like that is a phase in the Christian's path to salvation.
Yeah, but so in the Christian view of salvation, that is the final stage, is being resurrected.
Resurrected, but then surely there's a heaven, right? Where does heaven come in there?
It's an embodied experience.
Right. Okay. So he's resurrected in heaven. Is that the thing?
In your resurrected body.
Oh, so that's great. I mean, that's very easy to reconcile, I think, because Sri Ramakrishna believes in an eternal heaven where you can just commune with God. So he'll just say the Christian has an embodied communion with God.
Some people experience themselves as embodied, and some people.
Yeah. Why not? Yeah.
And that doesn't contradict sort of basic Vedantic principles of transcending the body, mind complex, and the Atmans. Like, aren't we now getting to that third category of kind of ultimate?
So is it physical in the same sense that this is physical?
Yes.
So in the Christian understanding of the soul, you're not a complete person without a body, which is why Paul says in his letters, if there isn't the resurrection, then none of this matters.
Yeah, but so I mean, is it literally like the
Yep.
Yes.
It's not a heavenly
Jesus
counterpart
comes
to
back
the.
and talks to the disciples.
Yeah.
and
All that's there.
Shakes their hand.
But is that heaven, or is there something?
to touch his body?
But is that heaven?
Yeah, you keep your body.
This
The
is
teaching
supposed to be the thing that they get to.
But what I mean is, does that go on ad infinitum? I mean,
Yeah. But so
On Earth. I mean, is that
I'm
the thing?
curious
No.
that- yeah.
Up there.
Well,
What?
It's a new Earth. It's something analogous
It's
to
right.
Earth.
But then there's a new body or no?
Right,
Old
it's
body, new Earth?
heavenly
Or
Earth.
what?
It's
Restored
body,
body.
Huh?
body, new earth.
It's the same body, a restored.
Same body, new Earth?
Resurrected
I mean, is it very clear in Christian eschatology, or is it?
I think we're getting a little sidetracked.
So, okay, maybe
There's one more question. I'd like to get one more
other people, yeah.
person before, one more voice before we have to wrap things up. Yes, please, yes. Yeah.
This is coming from complete left field. At the very beginning of your talk, you introduced a metaphor about kind of spiritual ascent that ended with a vision of the universe as a mansion of mirth.
Mhm.
And I was very taken by the use of parables and the metaphors that he uses to explain his particular vision. But this struck me as quite unique, a universe of mirth, and particularly because the word mirth introduces a whole different dimension and affect actually into his vision. So I just wanted to ask you to elaborate why mirth? I mean, what is encompassed by that? And how does he envision a universe
Yeah.
so pluralistic in this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So mirth. So again, terminology. So mirth is maja, majar kuti in Bangla. So maja is actually a kind of, I think it comes from Urdu rather than Sanskrit. Maza. So delight. And where does it come from? We can trace it back to the ontology of reality as Sat Chit Ananda, in the Ananda aspect. So that the bliss aspect of God. And because he accepts the personal God as real, Shakti as real, everything in this world is a real manifestation of this blissful Shakti. So that everything is bliss to him. That would be the, yeah.
So maybe on that mirthful note, we can once again thank Professor Ayon Maharaj for a really
Thank you.
great Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
I thank you, Vineet, for giving a great response as well.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.